The bruises on Amari's wrist weren't just injuries. They were another man's mark on Ju Wonshik's territory. And if there was one thing the city knew, it was that Wonshik didn't share. Not his streets, not his business, and certainly not the woman who had been a silent ghost in his mind for 3 weeks. When he confronted her, she stammered a frantic lie about clumsiness, her eyes downcast as she tried to retreat into the shadows of the closing club. But the lie didn't matter. The decision had been made the second her sleeve slipped. To Wonshik, whoever had dared to touch her wasn't just an abuser. They were a problem that needed to be erased from his city. The night was winding down at Wonshik's elite establishment, the heart of his sprawling domain. The last of the city's power elite were filtering out, passing through velvet ropes and past armed doormen whose corporate suits hid credentials of a much more violent nature. Inside, the smooth rhythm of midnight jazz pulsed through the walls, but it couldn't compete with the cold, predatory thrum in Wonshik's veins as he watched Amari move between the empty tables. For 3 weeks, he had made a study of her. He had memorized the exact angle of her frame when she thought she was alone and the way she had begun to flinch at any sudden noise, except for his voice. It was as if she instinctively understood the difference between a man who made empty threats and a man who delivered finality. The conflict, the internal shift. Wonshik knew he shouldn't be watching her this closely. She was staff, and he had spent a lifetime building rigid lines to keep his world orderly and his conscience quiet. But Amari had a way of blurring those lines. When she first started, she had been vibrant and bold, her sharp tongue more than a match for his lieutenant's rough humor. Now, seeing that light extinguished by someone else's hand, Wonshik realized that his rules were about to be broken for the first time. The night was winding down at Wonshik's elite establishment, the heart of his sprawling domain. The last of the city's power elite were filtering out, passing through velvet ropes and past armed doormen whose corporate suits hid credentials of a much more violent nature. Inside, the smooth rhythm of midnight jazz pulsed through the walls, but it couldn't compete with the cold, predatory thrum in Wonshik's veins as he watched Amari move between the empty tables. For 3 weeks, he had made a study of her. He had memorized the exact angle of her frame when she thought she was alone and the way she had begun to flinch at any sudden noise, except for his voice. It was as if she instinctively understood the difference between a man who made empty threats and a man who delivered finality. The conflict, the internal shift. Wonshik knew he shouldn't be watching her this closely. She was staff, and he had spent a lifetime building rigid lines to keep his world orderly and his conscience quiet. But Amari had a way of blurring those lines. When she first started, she had been vibrant and bold, her sharp tongue more than a match for his lieutenant's rough humor. Now, seeing that light extinguished by someone else's hand, Wonshik realized that his rules were about to be broken for the first time. The air inside the club was a carefully curated blend of expensive tobacco, aged scotch, and the low, velvet thrum of a saxophone that seemed to vibrate in the very floorboards. It was a space designed for the city's power elite to forget their sins, or perhaps to commit new ones under the watchful eyes of men who were paid to be invisible. At the center of this midnight orbit sat Ju Wonshik. He didn't just own the club, he ruled it with a silent, iron-fisted precision that made even the most arrogant politicians mind their tone when they crossed his threshold. Wonshik sat in his usual booth, a shadow among shadows. His attire, a dark, perfectly tailored corporate suit jacket over an open white dress shirt, spoke of a man who moved between worlds with ease. The gold chain around his neck caught the dim amber light, a subtle reminder of the street-born aggression that still simmered beneath his polished exterior. His short, tactical-style haircut and the glimpse of dense ink peeking from his collar were the only other hints of the violent history that had bought him this throne. To Wonshik, the club was more than a business. It was a sanctuary governed by a rigid set of professional codes. He lived by lines that were never to be crossed, boundaries that kept his world orderly and his conscience at a manageable distance. Foremost among those rules was a strict detachment from the staff. They were cogs in a beautiful machine, essential but replaceable, and he viewed them with the same cold, analytical focus he applied to his ledgers. He studied their movements, their efficiency, and the exact angle of their posture when they thought no one was watching, not out of care, but out of a need for absolute control. This discipline was what made him the king of the club. His lieutenants, men like Mateo, knew better than to question the order he maintained. When one chick entered a room, the atmosphere shifted. It wasn't the loud, boisterous fear commanded by a common thug, but the heavy, expectant silence reserved for a man who delivered on every silent threat he made. He prided himself on that predictability. In a city of chaos, one chick was the one constant, a man of ice and iron who never let his guard down and never, ever allowed the personal to bleed into the professional. Yet, as he watched the smoke curl toward the hidden speakers, his gaze inevitably drifted back to her. Amari was moving between the tables with a grace that was increasingly fractured, a vibrant spirit that had begun to dim right before his eyes. She was the only variable in his perfectly calculated world that he couldn't quite solve. For 3 weeks, he had felt the tug of an unfamiliar fixation, a crack in the armor of his own making. He told himself it was merely a territorial instinct, a glitch in his management of the staff, but the way his pulse thrummed in time with the jazz suggested a much more dangerous reality. The king was still on his throne, but for the first time in years, the rules he had built to protect himself were beginning to feel like a cage. The obsession had started with a singular, sharp observation 3 weeks ago. One chick sat in the habitual silence of his corner booth, a predator in a velvet-lined den, his eyes following Amari as she moved through the dim, golden light of the lounge. To any other patron, she was simply an efficient waitress, graceful, attentive, and invisible in the way staff are meant to be. But one chick didn't see people in generalities. He saw them in fractions and angles. He had spent 21 nights documenting her decline in the ledgers of his mind. He remembered her first shift, the way she had been vibrant, her laughter a bright, silver thread that cut through the heavy smoke of the club. She had been bold then, possessing a sharp tongue that could trade barbs with Mateo, his most volatile lieutenant, without her pulse so much as quickening. One chick had found himself intrigued by that fire, a spark of genuine life in a room filled with calculated masks. But over these 3 weeks, the shadows had begun to swallow her. He watched the exact angle of her posture when she thought she was unobserved, the slight cave of her shoulders, the way she tucked her chin as if bracing for a blow. He noticed how she had started to flinch at raised voices from the bar, her eyes darting toward the exit with a frantic, animal instinct. Yet, she never flinched at his voice. Even when he barked a command that made the rest of the staff freeze, she simply steadied herself, as if some deep, intuitive part of her recognized that he was the only man in the room who delivered on his promises rather than just making idle threats. This silent study was a violation of his own code. He was a man of strict lines, lines that kept his world orderly and his conscience manageable. Staff were supposed to be shadows, not the center of his gravity. Every time he caught himself tracking the rhythm of her movements instead of the movement of his enemies, a cold spike of self-loathing pierced his chest. It was a weakness he couldn't afford, an attraction that felt less like a romance and more like a tactical error. He tried to tell himself it was merely a territorial concern. He was the king of this domain, and Amari was a part of his ecosystem. Any change in her was a change in his order. But as he watched her clear a table, the amber light catching the weary tension in her jaw, one chick knew he was lying to himself. He wasn't just guarding his territory. He was guarding her, his thoughts invading her life just as surely as the unknown threat that was slowly extinguishing her light. The struggle between his ironclad rules and this new, possessive pull was a war he was beginning to lose, and in his world, losing control was the first step toward the grave. In the beginning, Amari had been a riot of color and sound in a room designed for hushed conspiracies. When she first walked into the club 3 weeks ago, she hadn't looked like a woman who knew how to be a shadow. One chick remembered the way she had stood, spine straight, chin tilted upward with a defiant elegance that refused to be intimidated by the velvet ropes or the heavy, armed presence of his men. She had been vibrant, possessing a spark that the stale, expensive air of the lounge couldn't stifle. He recalled a night during her first week when Mateo, a man whose humor was as crude as his methods, had made a particularly biting comment about the vintage of an imported wine. Most of the staff would have lowered their eyes and hurried away, but Amari had simply arched an eyebrow. She had traded barbs with the lieutenant with a sharp-tongued wit that left Mateo momentarily speechless and the rest of the table in rare, genuine laughter. She was bold, a woman who occupied her space with a terrifyingly beautiful confidence, moving between tables with a rhythm that was entirely her own. But as one chick watched her now, that girl was a ghost. The transformation was a silent tragedy written in the angle of her shoulders and the frantic, animal-like darting of her eyes. The bold laughter had been replaced by a hollow, practiced silence. The sharp tongue was now a stammering instrument of apology. She moved through the club not as a participant, but as a survivor, clearing tables with a desperate, trembling speed that suggested she was constantly counting the seconds until she could disappear. The most damning evidence was the flinch. Earlier that evening, a group of politicians had broken into a loud, boisterous argument at the bar. The sudden roar of voices had caused Amari to nearly drop her tray, her entire body convulsing in a sharp, instinctive jerk of terror. It was the reaction of a woman who lived in a state of perpetual ambush. Yet, as she scurried past one chick's booth, her eyes had briefly met his, and for a fleeting second, the flinch vanished. She didn't fear him. She recognized the difference between the men who used noise to intimidate and the man who used silence to deliver on a promise. The contrast was a physical weight in one chick's chest. The vibrant girl who had invaded his thoughts 3 weeks ago was being systematically erased, replaced by this flinching shadow who tried to hide her broken spirit behind a white apron and a clumsy lie. Seeing her like this, sad, exhausted, and marked by a violence she refused to name, sent a predatory thrum through his pulse that no midnight jazz could soothe. The woman who had dared to be bold in his world was being crushed by a world he didn't control, and for Ju one chick, that was a violation he could no longer tolerate. The end of the night at the club always brought a certain clarity, the kind that only exists when the music stops and the masks of the city's elite finally begin to slip. Ju one chick remained in his corner booth, his presence a heavy, silent anchor as the last of the patrons vanished into the DC night. Amari moved through the wreckage of the evening, clearing glasses with a robotic, trembling efficiency that grated against one chick's nerves. He watched her approach a nearby table where a wine glass had been overturned, its contents spreading across the white linen like a fresh wound. As she reached out to steady the tray, her movements were frantic, her focus entirely internal. She was so consumed by the need to be invisible that she didn't notice the hem of her sleeve snagging on the edge of the table. In one smooth, agonizing second, the fabric pulled back. The amber light of the lounge hit her forearm, illuminating a constellation of deep, purple-black bruises that wrapped around her thin wrist like a jagged bracelet. These weren't the marks of a tumble or a stray corner. They were the distinct, unmistakable impressions of a man's fingers, squeezed with enough force to claim the skin beneath. Amari, one chick said, his voice a low, dangerous vibration that cut through the lingering jazz. She froze, her entire body locking up as she realized the exposure. With a sharp, panicked intake of breath, she yanked her sleeve down, her hands shaking so violently the tray rattled against the table. I'm sorry, sir, she stammered, her voice thin and brittle. Just clumsy. I tripped on the stairs this morning. I'm fine, really. One chick stood, his tall, tattooed frame casting a long shadow that seemed to swallow the table whole. He didn't move toward her, yet the space between them felt charged with a sudden, predatory heat. He looked at her, not as a boss looking at an employee, but as a king looking at a violation of his peace. He saw the way she tucked her chin, the faint mark on her cheek he had noticed earlier, now seemingly darker in the silence of the room. The excuse of clumsiness was an insult to his intelligence, a flimsy veil over a reality that was now impossible to ignore. He had spent 3 weeks watching her vibrant spirit vanish, replaced by this flinching creature who lived in the shadow of a threat he hadn't yet named. "Look at me," he commanded. It wasn't a request. She lifted her head, her eyes swimming with a mixture of shame and a terror so deep it made his own pulse skip a beat. In that gaze, one chick saw the truth. The violence wasn't random, and it wasn't over. It was a weight she carried every time she left his doors, a claim that another man had dared to place on something within one chick's domain. The professional lines he had drawn to keep his world orderly suddenly felt like ash. The rules about staff, the boundaries of his conscience, they all disintegrated in the face of the raw, jagged reality of her pain. He didn't need to hear a name or a story. He had seen the marks. Whatever bastard had done this had just signed their own death warrant. "Go to the back, Amari," one chick said, his voice terrifyingly calm, the kind of calm that preceded a storm. "You're done for the night." She didn't argue. She turned and retreated, her footsteps silent on the carpet, leaving one chick alone in the dim light. He looked down at the spilled wine on the table, the red liquid staining the cloth, and felt the rhythm of his pulse accelerate. The study was over. The decision was made. The city was about to find out exactly what happened when someone touched what belonged to Ju Won-shik. The heavy oak doors of the club had barely clicked shut behind the last employee when the atmosphere in the room curdled from jazz-infused luxury to something far more industrial and dangerous. Won-shik didn't return to his booth. He remained standing by the table with the blood-red wine stain, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his dark suit trousers. The calm he projected was a lie. Beneath the surface, his blood was a cold, rushing river of predatory intent. "Mateo," he said, the name barely more than a breath, yet it carried the weight of a death sentence. His lead lieutenant stepped forward. Mateo was a man built of sharp edges and scarred knuckles, someone who understood the language of the city's underbelly better than most men understood their own mothers. He had been watching the exchange with Amari from a distance, and he knew the look on one chick's face. It was the look that preceded a purge. "Boss," Mateo acknowledged, stopping a respectful 3 paces away. "The girl," one chick began, his gaze fixed on the spot where Amari had vanished into the back hallway. "Amari, I want everything. I want her address, her phone records, and every name she's associated with in the last 6 months. I want to know who she goes home to and who follows her when she leaves." Mateo hesitated for a fraction of a second, a lifetime in their world. "She's staff, boss. You've always said the help is off limits for internal intelligence. You made that rule yourself after the New York business. You said the lines keep us clean." One chick turned his head slowly, his eyes locking onto Mateo's with a terrifying, vacant intensity. The gold chain at his neck shimmered under the dim house lights. "The lines are gone, Mateo. Someone has mistaken my establishment for a playground. They didn't just touch a waitress. They put their hands on something under my roof. They've marked my territory with her blood. That makes them my business." The lieutenant nodded once, the air in the room suddenly feeling several degrees colder. He knew that when one chick spoke of territory, he wasn't talking about property lines or profit margins. He was talking about the absolute, unquestioned sovereignty of his word. To hurt Amari was to spit in the face of the king. "Find out who he is," one chick continued, his voice dropping to a low, gravelly rasp. "I don't want a profile. I want a location. I want to know where he sleeps and what he fears. And Mateo, do it quietly. She doesn't need more monsters at her door tonight." Mateo pulled a burner phone from his jacket and began tapping out the orders to their digital specialists and street-level trackers. In the digital age, a woman like Amari left a trail of breadcrumbs, rent payments, bus passes, emergency room visits that went unreported to the police. Within the hour, the machinery of the Korean syndicate would be stripping her life down to its barest bones. One chick walked to the tall windows overlooking the rain-slicked streets of D.C. He looked out at the city he had conquered, a city of rules and power, and realized he had officially crossed the most dangerous line of all. He was no longer a businessman managing a managed conscience. He was a man possessed by a singular, violent purpose. He had broken his own law for a woman who didn't even know his real name. And as he watched the distant headlights of an ambulance flicker against the glass, he knew there was no turning back. The shockwave of what he was about to do would start here, in this quiet club, and by morning, it would leave the entire city trembling in its wake. The hunt didn't happen in the bright, clinical light of a police station. It happened in the digital shadows and the rain-slicked back alleys where the syndicate's reach was absolute. By 3 in the morning, the orderly world one chick so meticulously maintained had shifted its entire weight toward a single objective. Mateo stood in the center of the club's private office, flipping through a thin manila folder that felt heavier than it looked. "His name is Marcus Thorne," Mateo said, his voice flat, devoid of the humor he usually displayed. He's a mid-level fixer for the harbor unions. Thinks he's a player because he has a few councilmen in his pocket and a cousin in the district attorney's office. He's got a history of clumsy girlfriends, boss. 3 of them ended up in the ICU over the last 5 years. No charges were ever filed. The files just disappeared. One chick sat behind his desk, his silhouette framed by the glowing skyline of Washington, D.C. He didn't look at the folder. He was looking at his own hands, the knuckles white as he gripped the edge of the mahogany desk. The mention of Thorne's untouchable status didn't anger him. It disgusted him. In one chick's world, power was a responsibility, a burden of iron and blood. To use it to break a woman like Amari was a sin that went beyond business. It was a failure of manhood. Where is he now? One chick asked. He's at a private gambling den in Anacostia, Mateo replied, celebrating a big win on a union contract. He's loud, he's drunk, and he's telling anyone who will listen that he's the king of the waterfront. He thinks because the Blue Jackets look the other way, the rest of the world is blind, too. One chick stood up, the movement slow and predatory. He reached for his jacket, the gold chain around his neck catching the light like a cold promise. Thorne's mistake wasn't just the violence, it was the arrogance. The man lived in a bubble of perceived invulnerability, protected by petty bribes and local influence. He had no idea that he had stepped out of the shallow pond of local corruption and into the deep, dark ocean of the syndicate. He thinks he's untouchable because no one has dared to reach for him, one chick said, his voice a low, terrifying rasp. He hasn't met a man who doesn't care about his councilmen or his cousins. He hasn't met me. The drive to Anacostia was silent. 2 black SUVs moved through the city like funeral carriages, bypassing the main thoroughfares. One chick watched the rain blur the streetlights, his mind replaying the image of the thumb-sized bruises on Amari's wrist. Thorne was a man who feasted on the weak, a scavenger who mistook silence for permission. He was about to learn that in the ironbound district, silence was simply the breath taken before the kill. When they arrived at the nondescript warehouse that housed the gambling den, the air was thick with the smell of cheap cigars and desperation. One chick stepped out into the rain, his men flanking him with the synchronized grace of a military unit. They didn't burst through the doors with shouting and gunfire. They moved with the cold, inevitable weight of a landslide. Inside, Marcus Thorne was exactly as described, a bloated, loud-mouthed man in an expensive, ill-fitting suit, holding a stack of chips and laughing at a joke only he found funny. He looked up as the room went suddenly quiet, his cocky grin faltering as he saw the tattooed man in the dark suit walking toward him. "Who the hell are you?" Thorne barked, trying to summon the bravado that usually kept people at bay. "Do you know who I am? I'm Marcus Thorne. I own this neighborhood. You touch me, and you'll have the whole city on your head." One chick didn't stop until he was inches from the man, his cold, intense focus pinning Thorne to his seat. He didn't raise his hand. He didn't need to. The sheer gravity of his presence made the gambling chips rattle on the table. "You are a man who has made a very loud noise in a very quiet world," one chick said, his voice barely a whisper that carried to every corner of the room. "And you have left marks on something that belongs to me. That makes you a ghost. You just haven't realized you're dead yet." Thorne's face went pale, the realization finally dawning on him that his credentials meant nothing here. The man who thought he was untouchable had finally been reached. The silence in the gambling den was so absolute it felt heavy, a physical weight that pressed against the lungs of everyone in the room. Marcus Thorne stared up at one chick, the sweat on his brow glistening like grease under the flickering fluorescent lights. The bravado he had used to terrorize women and bully union workers was evaporating, replaced by the cold, sinking realization that his world of petty favors and localized power had just collided with a much larger, darker orbit. "You don't understand," Thorne managed to choke out, his voice cracking. "I'm not just some guy. I'm the bridge. You touch me, and the DA's office loses their cut. The harbor police lose their bonus. You're talking about an orderly world? I'm the one who keeps the cops away from places like this. I've got the kind of friends who can make a man like you, even a man like you, disappear into a federal cell for 100 years. One chick didn't blink. He reached out, his movements slow and deliberate, and picked up a heavy, leaded glass of whiskey from the table. He turned it in his hand, watching the amber liquid swirl. "You think your connections are a shield," one Shik said, his tone conversational, which was far more terrifying than a scream. "You think the people you pay to look the other way will suddenly find their sight when I come for you. You are mistaken. Those men don't love you, Marcus. They fear the chaos your absence might bring. But they fear me more." Mateo leaned in, his voice a low rasp. "Boss, he's not lying about the depth. Our tech guys just flagged 3 encrypted calls coming from this location. He's already signaled his friends. We've got 2 unmarked cruisers sitting 3 blocks away, and a call went out to a private security firm, ex-Special Forces guys who handle disruptions for the DA's office. If we take him now, it's not just a hit. It's a declaration of war against the city's shadow government." The orderly world one Shik had built was predicated on a delicate balance. He stayed in his lane, the law stayed in theirs, and everyone grew rich in the silence. By reaching for Thorn, one Shik was effectively pulling the pin on a grenade that would blow a hole through that peace. The city would wake up to a territory war that hadn't been seen in decades, a collision between the syndicate and the corrupt machinery that ran the capital. Thorn saw the momentary silence and took it for hesitation. A sickly, triumphant grin spread across his face. "That's right. You're a businessman, right? You know the cost. Is one little waitress worth burning your whole kingdom to the ground? She's just a girl. I'll give you 10 more just like her. Better once. Just walk away, and we forget this ever happened." The air in the room seemed to freeze. One Shik looked down at his wrist, thinking of the bruises he had seen on Amari, the marks of a man who thought he could buy and break anything because he was connected. He thought of the flinch in her eyes and the way her vibrant light had been extinguished by this bloated, arrogant scavenger. One Shik's grip on the whiskey glass tightened until the knuckles of his tattooed hand turned white. With a sudden, explosive motion, he shattered the glass against the edge of the table. He didn't use the shard to strike. He simply let the pieces fall, a symbolic end to the fragile peace he had maintained for years. "You speak of cost," one Shik said, his voice dropping to a register that made the floorboards vibrate. "But you have no idea what I am willing to pay. My kingdom was built on the blood of men who thought they were too big to fail. If I have to burn this city to the ground to teach you that my house is sacred, then let it burn." He turned to Mateo, his eyes cold and twin dark like the barrels of a gun. "Tell the men to prepare. We aren't just taking Thorn. We're taking everything he touches. If the city wants a war for the soul of a waitress, I'll give them one they'll never forget." As one Shik walked toward the exit, the distant sound of sirens began to wail, approaching fast. The territory war had begun. He had officially crossed the line, and as the red and blue lights began to flash against the warehouse windows, one Shik felt a strange, terrifying sense of peace. The businessman was dead. The king had arrived. The sirens were a screaming chorus that died abruptly as the black SUVs of the syndicate cut them off, boxing in the unmarked cruisers 2 blocks from the gambling den. One Shik didn't wait for his men to clear the path. He stepped out into the rain, the cold water slicking back his tactical-style hair and darkening the ink that crawled up his neck. The power elite of the city, the men who pulled Thorn's strings, had sent their muscle to protect their investment. They had expected a negotiation. They had expected a man who valued his orderly world enough to compromise. They were wrong. Mateo and his team moved with a surgical, terrifying speed, disarming the private security contractors before they could even chamber around. There was no gunfire, only the heavy thud of bodies hitting pavement and the rhythmic clicking of zip ties. One Shik walked through the carnage with his hands in his pockets, his gaze fixed on the back of the warehouse where Marcus Thorn was being dragged out by his collar. Thorn was hysterical now, his expensive suit soaked with mud and his face a mask of primal terror. "You can't do this," he shrieked, looking toward the immobilized police cruisers. "They're right there. They're watching. You're finished, One Shik. The city will tear you apart." One Shik stopped in front of him, the red and blue emergency lights reflecting in his eyes like a digital fever. He didn't look at the police. He looked at Thorn's hands, the hands that had left marks on Amari. "The city is made of glass, Marcus," One Shik said, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that seemed to carry under the rain. "And you have been throwing stones in my house. You think those men are here to save you? They are here to witness. I want them to see what happens when the shadow they've tolerated finally steps into the light. One Shick reached out, his movements calm and devoid of anger, and gripped Thorne's wrist. He didn't squeeze with the chaotic rage of a common thug. He applied a precise, agonizing pressure that forced Thorne to his knees. The sound of the man's whimpering was the only thing audible over the rain. "This is the hand that claimed her," One Shick whispered, leaning in so close that Thorne could see the cold, intense focus in his pupils. "You thought your connections made you a god. But in my world, there is only one law. What I protect stays protected. What I erase stays gone." With a swift, sickeningly efficient motion, One Shick delivered a strike that didn't just break bone. It sent a message of absolute finality. He didn't kill the man. That would have been too easy, a quick exit from the debt he owed. Instead, he left Thorne broken on the asphalt, a hollowed-out version of the fixer who had once thought himself untouchable. One Shick turned his back on the broken man and looked directly at the dashboard camera of the nearest police cruiser. He didn't hide his face. He didn't flee. He stood there, a king in the rain, a man who had just dismantled a decade of corrupt alliances for the sake of a waitress's dignity. "Tell your masters," One Shick said to the frozen officers behind the glass, "that the tax for their silence has just gone up. The ironbound syndicate is no longer interested in their order. From tonight, the only rules that matter are mine." The shockwave was instantaneous. By the time One Shick stepped back into his SUV, the phones of every councilman, judge, and lobbyist in D.C. were vibrating with the news. The King of Beelans hadn't just settled a personal score. He had declared the city's shadow government obsolete. He had traded his manageable conscience for a violent, protective honor, and as the SUVs pulled away into the dark, the city's power elite realized with a collective shiver that the man they thought they controlled was actually the one holding the leash. The morning after the storm, the city of Washington, D.C., woke to a silence that felt bruised. The news of Marcus Thorne's public dismantling and the surgical neutralization of his high-level protectors rippled through the corridors of power like a cold front. In the mahogany row offices of K Street and the backrooms of the Capitol, the conversation wasn't about politics or profit. It was about the man who had burned his own bridges for a waitress. A new legend was taking root, one of a king who had abandoned the safety of his cold, calculated rules for a sudden, violent sense of honor. Inside the quiet sanctuary of the club, the amber light of the morning sun filtered through the high windows, catching the dust motes dancing over empty tables. Amari stood in the center of the room, her hands trembling slightly as she smoothed the fabric of her white apron. She had heard the whispers. She knew that Thorne was gone, erased from the streets he had once haunted, and she knew the city was trembling because of it. The heavy office doors at the top of the stairs creaked open, and One Shick descended. He looked different in the daylight. Tired, perhaps, but settled in a way he hadn't been for weeks. The dark suit was pristine, the gold chain at his neck a steady glint, but the intensity in his eyes had shifted from the predatory hunger of the hunt to a quiet, protective vigilance. He stopped a few feet from her, observing the space between them. For the first time in 3 weeks, Amari didn't flinch. She didn't tuck her chin or retreat into the shadows. She looked at him, her eyes clear and filled with a realization that went beyond words. She saw the man who had looked at her bruises and seen a declaration of war. "The rules have changed, Amari," One Shick said, his voice a low, steady anchor in the quiet room. "You don't have to look over your shoulder anymore. Not here. Not anywhere in this city." She touched her wrist, where the purple marks were already beginning to fade, hidden beneath a fresh bandage. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "You had rules. You had a world that was orderly. Why break it all for me?" One Shick looked around the club, the establishment he had built on discipline and detachment. He thought of the manageable conscience he had once prided himself on, and the lines he had spent a lifetime drawing. Then he looked back at her, at the vibrant spark that was slowly, tentatively returning to her gaze. "Because some things are worth more than order," he replied, "and because no one lays a hand on what is mine." The statement was possessive, yes, but it carried a weight of absolute safety that Amari had never known. She wasn't just staff anymore. She was the living proof of a new era. The city now understood that Ju Wonshik was no longer a man who could be bargained with through bribes or political pressure. He was a man who governed by a singular, personal decree. His people were untouchable. As the jazz began to play softly through the speakers, signaling the start of a new day, the power elite began to return to Belance. They moved with a new kind of caution, their voices lowered and their eyes diverted. They realized that the master of the house had traded his ledgers for a sword, and that the waitress clearing their tables was no longer a bystander in their world. She was the reason the old world had died. Amari was safe, and in the heart of the capital, a new, terrifyingly protective legend had been born.